You know, certain Nord guards may appreciate the fact that you use both your hands that the gods gave you for your weapon. But what if you use both of them for two different ones? Does that count? Is that still two-handed use? Somehow I don't think that's what he had in mind. Anyway, so let's talk about offhand weapons and their pros and cons. I'm going to be going roughly in order of worst to better, more or less. For the main hand weapon, which doesn't really matter in this case, I'm going to go with the side sword just because I never tire of showing it. It's pretty. So first, a hefty impact weapon. This can be a hammer, a mace, a heavy axe. Some axes are rather light, so that can be a different story. But either way, something like this, right? Pretty awful choice. There are some good things to be said about this. For one, weapons like this tend to be shorter, so not as likely to get in the way, and you can even choke up and make sure that it really doesn't get in the way. In this case, that would be wise, potentially, because there's a little more, room for error. The ability to choke up and keep it all the way retracted is neat, although that also means it takes an additional action to deploy it, so to speak. Now, defensively, you could still use the haft, of course, to kind of swipe an attack aside. And obviously, it's an option that packs a punch. Right? This is a significant threat to the opponent that they have to deal with, right? Finally, they can be relatively affordable, depending on what it is. There are very simple early medieval maces that would be extremely cheap to make. In fact, it could even be a studded club or a short golden dog, things like that. There are all steel versions that are quite elaborate. They're clearly made for nobility. So that depends, as it always does. The cons. The hand is extremely exposed. That's the case with some swords. Not all of them have nice complex hilts like this, but it's a downside. Like defensively, the most you get for this kind of weapon is usually a discard. That doesn't do a whole lot to protect your hand. It can prevent a blade from sliding down. You get your fingers, but that's about it. Durability can be an issue. Basically, it's either durability or it's speed. What I mean is, if you have a lighter version with a wooden haft, then yeah, trying to defend with that, and that's of course the main purpose of an offhand weapon for the most part, yeah, this is going to accumulate damage much worse. If you reinforce it, it's going to be heavier. If you have an all steel haft, it's going to be quite a bit heavier. So then you don't have the speed. You don't have the speed to begin with. That's another con. It's a bit sluggish, because it's top heavy, so you can't really quickly react, which again, for defensive use, is kind of a problem. Of course, hammers, maces, and axes can be used defensively. And in fact, there are some things that they can do that swords can't. Like, again, hook, bind, control, wrench, things like that. So it's ups and downs, but overall, it is the clunkiness, I think, is the main problem. And again, how vulnerable the hand is. And another con is they're awkward to carry. Even just one by itself is often not quite as convenient to carry as a sword. So if you have that in addition to your main weapon, then yeah, it's not great. Next, a spear. This one doesn't have a head, but just imagine it does. Very strange choice, right? Why would you pick a spear as an offhand weapon? Well, it's not as bad as you might think. Either a spear or a staff. In fact, if you hold it in the middle, you can parry both above and below. Again, there comes a point where leverage works against you, but you still have a decent amount to work with. I'm not going to count the defensive use as a pro because it's kind of canceled by another con. Well, two really. One, again, the hand is extremely exposed, and two, this is a wooden haft, so durability is a bit of an issue. But other than that, it's not bad. I've talked about how you could combine it with a buckler, or a gauntlet for that matter, to give you pretty good protection. So it's not terrible. Then other pros, of course, you have reach. Right now it's limited. If you choke way down and use as much reach as you can, Again, the leverage is going to be a huge problem. If an opponent binds that, then you have almost no chance of getting out of that pretty much. But if you grip it about in the center, you still have a decent amount of reach. And you can couch it as well, support it a little bit like that. Price, these are cheap. That's also an advantage. But the cons are also significant. So one being, again, that can very much get in the way. Not necessarily too much, because again, you can try to keep it back and then use the mini for thrusts and then the other weapon for strikes and other offensive actions. And then carrying, I mean, the good thing is this can function as a walking stick, right? So you can wear the sword normally, then you can carry this around. It's not too bad, but it's still not exactly convenient, especially compared to pretty much all the other options. Next, a dagger or a knife. This does not have a lot of disadvantages, but the advantages are also not as strong. So, for one, of course, this does not get in the way at all. This is basically enhanced single-handed sword. Right? You can imagine fighting the way you normally would with a single-handed sword, and instead of having the hand here, like on the chest or behind the back or whatever, you just hold the dagger. You know, gotta make sure you don't poke yourself, but no big deal. You can easily work with the main weapon, and this is not going to get in the way whatsoever. Great. Another pro, good damage potential. Notice I said damage, not offense in general, because the reach is pitiful, of course, but also armor piercing, right? I mean, in the sense, or rather, the potential to exploit gaps in the armor, which may be more difficult than you might expect, but either way, so this will punch through mail. Well, single layer mail. Anyway, another obvious advantage, very easy to carry. I mean, this is only slightly less convenient than not having anything. And it's fast. I'm going to kind of group that together with the general advantage of being unobtrusive, shall we say, easy to combine, all of that. Cons, pitiful reach, obviously, only slightly better than unarmed. Very limited defensive capability. Good luck trying to parry a large sword with this, or let alone a polearm or an axe. This is not going to happen. Not a con, but something to point out. A warrior or a knight could wear this as a backup while using some other kind of offhand weapon. Like, you don't need to start out with this. You can just have this on your belt, and it's extremely quick to draw. One step up, a parrying dagger. Now we're talking. It's almost like the thing that was designed to be an offhand weapon is better than something that's just used as an offhand weapon. It mostly has the same advantages as a simple dagger, except it's not as convenient to carry, but it's much, much better defensively. It covers the hand. You have the quillons to trap a blade with, and typically the blades can be quite long. I would say on average, they're probably longer than a regular dagger. That's an excellent tool in the offhand, and of course it can also be used offensively. Really not a lot of drawbacks other than it still has limited reach, just like other daggers. And it's more expensive than a simple dagger or knife, of course. I should also mention the sai is a similar concept. Not as much hand protection, but still plenty of defense here. And it's a different take. You know, where the dagger is a thrusting weapon, this, from what I understand, is really more of a bludgeon. You know, this is a bar rather than a blade. So I'd argue it loses out a little bit on offense, not much, and gains in durability. Also easier to carry. Next, a buckler. Also a conventional, proper, so to speak, offhand weapon designed for that purpose. I mean, what's not to like, right? You have very solid offense. That's the main advantage. You know, whether it's a wooden buckler or a steel one. Steel in particular, of course, is very sturdy, just not quite as fast, perhaps. It's not much, obviously, but it covers more than the hand, covers the forearm. You can use it if you don't have a complex hilt. You can use it to cover your sword hand. Depending on the exact size of the buckler, it may be very easy to carry. Some are shown being worn on top of the sword, so it kind of combines with the sword. So it's pretty easy, very convenient to carry compared to a lot of other options. That's basically it. These are quite important, but there are not that many different pros the way I see it. Cons, well, it is small. It's actually fairly comparable to the parrying dagger. So if we go from the bottom here and line it up, and you can parry until about here, I think. So yeah, it's pretty comparable length, very similar to the diameter. Now, of course, the buckler goes in every direction, so to speak. This is just one length, whereas here you have that all around. So this is a little bit more effective in that way. And some bucklers also give you plenty of options to trap the opponent's blade. The spikes you see on them, at least the way I interpret them, they're really more for defensive use, to make sure that a blade doesn't slide off. You can kind of bind it and trap it and manipulate it, things like that, rather than use it for offense. And that's one of the cons, a lack of offense. Yes, you can bash with it, strike with the rim of the buckler, or perhaps the boss as well. Sometimes they do have a central spike, but getting stabbed with a dagger would be quite a bit worse than that. For the most part, it depends on the buckler, it depends on whether we're talking armor and whatnot, but generally I would think this is better for offense and also quicker. Spiked arm shield, pretty nifty. So you have similar advantages to the buckler, quite good for defense. It's different, like obviously you have much more length and less width. So if you count the entire defensive real estate, if you will, that's quite a bit more than both the parrying dagger and most bucklers, I would argue. And also, it's braced against the forearm. You can take pretty substantial hits. Also, offense, this is a little better because it's almost like having a push dagger in addition to the shield. So that's pretty good, although the reach is short, very short. That's a downside. It's really shorter than most daggers, and it doesn't get in the way at all, even less than a buckler and even a parrying dagger. I mean, it's just like using a single sword. The other arm is just here, and then when you need to, you can use it. So that's great. Cons, not as convenient to carry. It's a bit worse than a buckler, definitely worse than a parrying dagger. And then a big shield. Obvious advantage, plenty of protection, right? This is much, much more than any of the other options. And this is also the only thing they would have wanted on an actual battlefield rather than dueling or small melee situation without heavy armor. Because that's what kept warriors alive for the longest time. Not just against melee weapons, but especially also against various projectiles, be it rocks, arrows, javelins, etc., etc. This would be crucial. Another advantage is they can be cheap. Not necessarily, it depends very much on the type of shield, but the cheapest kind of shield you can get is very affordable. This type of shield in particular also has one distinctive advantage, is the enemy blade can get easily stuck in it. So if someone chops into it, it's not going to go all the way to the hand, and even if it did, there's a metal boss to prevent that, and then you probably have control over the weapon. So that's a pretty substantial advantage. But the cons are too. One, yeah, you bet this gets in the way much more than every single of the other options. Even a spear in the offhand. This is much worse, and also it's worse in one particular way. You can obstruct your own vision. If the opponent throws a feint to your head to make you raise up your shield, at which point you don't see very well, you can try to mitigate that by kind of peeking around it and still defending yourself. So this is largely a skill issue, but it's still not easy to avoid always to kind of obstruct your own vision. It's definitely much more of a concern than any of the other options. Even if you try to peek past the shield, there's always going to be a blind spot or like an entire blind area where you can't be attacked. So that's a downside. The other obvious downside is, this is strictly for battlefield use. I mean, this is not something one would walk around with in everyday life. It's just way too cumbersome. It can be carried on the back in a fantasy scenario as a traveling adventurer. Still not ideal in my opinion, but it could be done, again, depending on the type of shield and all that. And the pro I mentioned of an enemy weapon getting stuck in it also comes with a corresponding con, which is durability. You know, a shield like this can be hacked to pieces for sure. So damage can accumulate quite a bit. This will be destroyed much, much more easily than, say, a steel buckler or a parrying dagger or anything like that. Offhand, I don't really want to put in either pro or a con category. It's kind of a mixed bag. Like you can definitely hit harder with it than with a small buckler due to the larger mass, and also it has more reach because it's larger, but it's also not as quick as a smaller offhand weapon. So kind of cancels out, more or less. Then a second sword, a fairly small one. Now you might be surprised why I rank it this highly, and this depends very much on what context, what situation you're looking at. For battlefield use, obviously a shield is dramatically better than a second sword. In a duel, I mean, you could still very well argue that the shield is better, but I think a second sword is actually at this point kind of underrated. You know, after dual wielding has been so maligned, I do think it's actually pretty good. Is it better than a buckler? Not necessarily, but kind of. In my opinion, it may very well be, but that is entirely personal opinion. You can shuffle the order around any way you want. So, pros. Obviously, something with very good offense. Both offense and defense, in fact. You've got plenty to defend with, both upper and lower openings. You can thrust with it, you can cut. If you focus mainly on the primary sword and then use this whenever it's advantageous, then it's not really all that much of a hindrance, if at all. And it can be quite good. You know, someone who's actually trained, you know, someone who's experienced in the use of two swords can be quite pesky to deal with, just because it's an extra blade that you have to deal with if you have two. I mean, you know, against a two-handed sword, there's of course a power difference. Two-handed sword is going to be more dangerous offensively, but this is still something to contend with. So I do think both offense and defense are strong. So strong points of a second sword. Reach is excellent. That's an obvious advantage. Protection, that depends on the type. You know, if you have another complex hilt or basket hilt or something like that in the offhand, no problem at all. Cons does get more in the way than some of the other options. Even if it's not a huge problem, it's much more cumbersome than a dagger or a buckler, things like that. Less so than a large shield, I would argue. Also because it doesn't block your vision in any way. Then it's expensive. I mean, two swords. You have to be rich to afford that. And then walking around with that, not amazing. Now there are certain combinations that are conventional, like katana wakizashi, for example, but still much more hassle than carrying a dagger or a buckler. So what's the highest on my list? The Gou-Rang, Chinese hook shield. You'd be hard-pressed to come up with something more protective and effective in the offhand, in my opinion. You have, again, much like the spear example I talked about, you have the ability to guard both high and low. Again, the higher up you go, the more of a leverage disadvantage you have, but also the fact that there are hooks on there so that you're able to pull a weapon down and then use your own. That's very useful. I find these excellent to use in sparring. There is a spike. Now this may very well be more again for defense, to stop a blade there, make sure it doesn't slide down and get you in the leg or something, and to be able to bind it there. But obviously, punching with that would be quite dangerous as well. And you can even strike with it too. It does get in the way more than some other options, much more than a parrying dagger, of course, because it's longer. So that's just the give and take. If you're able to defend better, then it's going to be a little clunkier. That's just how it is. And this is not super convenient to carry. If we were talking like civilian everyday carry for self-defense on the streets, it's a bit much. It could be done, but it's, I don't know. I don't really quite see that. But other than that, it's really a solid option, I think. It gives you plenty of protection here. It's basically like a buckler with additional, well, it's almost like a buckler with dual parrying dagger, plus hooks. So yeah, I'm quite a fan of this design personally. In my book, really the only better offhand weapon is a gun. Oh, and kind of an honorable mention, an offhand sword or dagger with serrated blade. That actually makes a lot of sense to be able to, again, bind an opponent's blade better, wrench it, manipulate it, etc. The only thing that this is really missing is a guard. If this had like a basket hilt or a complex hilt or something and was a bit shorter, this would be an amazing offhand weapon. All right, that's my take on it. Let me know what you think, if you agree with the pros and cons, if you would weigh them differently or add or subtract some or whatever. If you have other opinions, thoughts, ideas, let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching and take care, folks. And for the main hand weapon, which doesn't really matter in this case, I'm gonna go with the fisted hammer, in case we need a hand while talking about offhand weapons. Why am I like this? Bonk.